This November, voters will be asked if they want to change Maine's traditional bear hunting methods. This will be like every other referendum before it, high on emotion, low on actual facts. Proponents say that we should learn how to hunt bears the way they do out west. But how do they hunt them out west? If only there was a radio station that would go ask. This is Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket, and the program is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine. Hunting bears is tough no matter where you are. They are smart and wary. They have keen senses. They're fast. Almost every bear harvested in Maine for decades has been taken with the help of bait, hounds, or traps. In fact, using bait accounts for about 80% of successful hunts. But even then, only about 30% of hunters are actually successful every year. A couple of decades ago, the use of bait and traps went to referendum in Colorado, Oregon, and Washington and passed. 1 decade ago, the same referendum came to Maine, but was rejected by Maine voters. Now, the Humane Society of the United States is trying again, and they point to those western states, saying that we should just get over our lazy way of hunting and hunt bears like they do out there. But how do they hunt them out there? Let's find out. Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine is brought to you by Hammond Lumber, Old Town Trading Post, Dysarts, EBS, and Napa Auto Parts. Today we go to Washington and Oregon. Next week, Colorado, just to get our first-hand view of bear management and regulation in those states. We'll talk a bit about how hunts are conducted in those states and talk about the terrain. Opponents of the referendum say the thick woods in Maine are nothing like those western states where you can often spot bears from miles away. Proponents argue that our thick forest cover is just an excuse, and the same arguments were made in those other states 20 years ago. Proponents argued that bear hunting got more popular out west after bait and hounds were banned. Opponents say that's not true. What actually happened was that states were forced to change their seasons and hunting licenses in hopes that more elk and deer hunters would take a bear when they were hunting for something else. So, since we've been asked to hunt like they do in Washington State, let's go there. Donnie Monterello is with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. Welcome to Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine.
Thank you.
Well, what is your title and position in Washington State?
I am the Carnivore Section Manager for Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, so I manage bear, cougar, and wolves statewide.
Well, what is the estimated population of bears in Washington?
You know, we don't have a real good estimate number of bears. We have a what I consider to be a strong bear population in the state, but you know, it numbers somewhere probably in the 15 to 20,000 number. So that we have a lot of bears in the state. We have a lot of secure bear habitat, but we don't have a good estimate for exactly how many bears there are.
Wow, 15 to 20,000. Okay, that's a state that's like 3 times the size of Maine. So, I'm guessing you share some of the same characteristics with Oregon, and that. Part of your eastern part of the state is pretty dry and fairly open, and the western part is, as I visited before, is kind of dense.
That's correct. So the western part of the state, the west slope of the Cascades, much wetter environment, fairly heavy timber. The eastern part of the state, the other side of the Cascade Mountain Range, drier. It's still most of the state is timbered. The only exception is the Columbia Basin, which is predominantly agriculture.
Okay.
So most of the forested environments of Washington have bears.
Yeah, my only experience with the eastern part of the state is that my brother lives in Spokane. So
right.
I see photos now and then. That's about it. So how has the population of bears changed, do you think, since baiting was eliminated in the state? Eliminated. Do you have any idea if it's changed?
Well, I don't know that it's changed. Certainly hunting methods have changed. We had a voter initiative that occurred in 95, 96 that did 2 things. For bears, anyways. It did other things for other species, but for bears, it made it unlawful to use bait for recreational hunting and for using dogs or hounds for recreational hunting. And so those are 2 hunting methods that, as you've probably already heard, tend to have higher success rates than not using those. And when we say, one of the terms that's often used to reflect not using dogs or bait, they call it boot hunting. It just means that you're not using those methods. You're just out spotting and stalking, so to speak. And so the hunting methods changed, which just means in Washington what we found is just success rates went down. Mm-hmm. We still harvest between 1,200 and 1,600 bears a year. We've had to make some changes over the years to still fall within the population and harvest objectives that we have, and so we tended to go to longer seasons, more or less expensive transport tag for bear to be able to still manage within those harvest parameters that that are objective.
Less expensive probably means less revenue for the department too, I'm guessing.
It depends. Over the course of the years, it's actually harder for us to tease that out because we've repackaged transport tags and so that they come in packages with deer and elk and less expensive standalone, and so we did other things that make it more challenging to tease that out, whether it was a loss of revenue or stable or increase. But we also saw that we've got the desired outcome that we were looking for occurred, and that is when we went to a less expensive tag and we increased the season length, and most importantly, overlapped the season so it occurred through most of all the deer and elk seasons. We saw an increase in the number of black bear transport tag holders, black bear hunters essentially.
Right.
A lot of those are just incidental folks that maybe in past years before the initiative when we had the use of dogs and bait, we probably had a higher the average black bear hunter was more interested in solely going out seeking bear only, and then we faded away from those methods after the voter initiative, and we tended to scale our seasons and our opportunity and our tags more associated with incidental bear harvest. We have a large number of deer and elk hunters in this state, and we see a tremendous spike in bear harvest now associated with opening day deer season, open day of elk season. When those deer and elk hunters now, they have a tag in their pocket because it's less expensive. We kind of hit that price break where I might see a bear, so they buy a tag. And just the sheer number of deer and elk hunters out there on opening days, we harvest a significant number of bears. I
do think it's interesting that our targets are about double for the bears that we wish to harvest in order to maintain appropriate levels in the state. Double what Washington State's is, even though we have only a third of the amount of territory. It's
one of the things that you guys have that we don't is the fall mass production. Our state is dominated by coniferous forests, not hardwood forests.
Yeah, exactly. And that's one of the difficulties I think we face is that we don't have a big berry population, which Colorado seems to rely on for their September hunt. For us, it is the acorns, the beech nuts.
Right.
And those are spread out all over, so it's hard to find a good concentration to say this is where the bears are going to be.
Right.
We'll take a break. I'm with Donnie Monterello, the principal bear biologist in the Washington State Department of Fish and Wildlife. With a referendum coming up that would ban using bait to hunt bears in Maine, proponents are arguing that we should be like Washington and learn how to hunt without it. So today on Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine, we're trying to figure out what that means. We're getting a first-hand comparison to see how much Maine and Washington have in common and whether it's even possible. This is Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine. Today we're visiting state wildlife biologists in Washington and Oregon, two states that banned the use of bait and hounds for hunting bear over 2 decades ago. Proponents say that if they can do it, Maine can do it. Opponents say our forests and terrain are nothing like out west and you can't compare. Donnie Monterello is the bear biologist in Washington State. One question is obvious. When the change was made there 20 years ago, how big a change was it? In Oregon, before baiting was banned, only 14% of bears were harvested that way to begin with, according to the Oregon Bear Management Plan. So that's not really a big change. In Maine, 80% of bears are harvested over bait. In Oregon, the biggest share was taken by hunters who just happened to come across a bear while hunting for deer or elk. So, Donnie, do you know what the percentage of bears over bait was before your referendum?
I don't, but I can tell you just kind of off the cuff that before the initiative, the majority of bears were harvested were either, with dogs or bait. So if you combine those two, that's the majority of bear harvests before our voter initiative that banned those two practices. And then since then, it's been shaped that the majority of bears harvested are just incidental by deer and elk hunters.
Okay. Do you think you've actually seen a surging interest in bear hunting itself, or is it just
No, actually, I think this is just my own intuition here. I don't. I think we probably had more interest in actually going bear hunting when we had the use of dogs and bait, where we had folks that were dedicated. They were putting together a trip to actually go bear hunting, and it was that time of year. Probably what it wasn't associated with going out and deer and elk hunting. I'm loading up and I'm going bear hunting for the week or for the weekend or whatever. Now, without those methods and those specific seasons for those two methods, now it tends to be I'm getting ready for my deer and elk hunt. I'm going to grab the $10 bear tag or whatever it is, $20 bear tag, and just have it in my back pocket in case I see a bear.
Yeah. What is the hunting season for bears? Don't you start like midsummer?
We do. And so one of the things that we did, anticipating that the bear harvest would go down, significantly without the use of dogs and bait. Again, those are not as efficient methods. The success rates those are more efficient methods. The success rates are higher with those two methods. So what we did is we increased the season length along with that change I mentioned about the price of a transport tag. So now the season starts anywhere, depends on the area, but it starts somewhere between August 1st and September 1st, and then runs to November 15th.
Oh, okay. When do your bears start to go to hibernation? Because by that time it seems like ours are sleeping.
So don't quite have the severe weather that you have in Maine. It's just that's timed with den entrance, and so it depends on the sex and the status of the animal. But shortly after that November closure, bears are starting to enter their den sites.
Okay. Maine does not allow Sunday hunting. Does Washington?
We do.
Okay. How many bears is a hunter allowed to harvest in a year?
It depends on the part of the state. It just ranges between 1 and 2. Mm-hmm. We do see when we look at the harvest information, though, that the majority of folks, even in the part of the state where they could harvest 2, majority of folks just harvest a single bear.
Okay. It's kind of funny to talk to the various states. Certainly Maine has a really dense, thick forest. You get to Colorado, and they're hunting on ridges and where they can spot a bear from 2 miles away with a spotting scope. How do Washington hunters hunt bear in that state?
Well, they don't use bait or hounds.
Right.
So that only leaves one method.
Yeah, that's right.
The sheer luck of running into one, and then some of what you mentioned, the spot and stalk, just mostly in eastern Washington, just looking across ridges, glassing, and those kinds of things. But again, I think that's a smaller segment of our harvest. A larger segment of our harvest is folks that are just out deer and elk hunting or for other reasons that are in the woods, and they just happen to stumble across a bear. So it's very opportunistic.
Okay. Does Washington State actively try to manage its bear population, setting thresholds about how big a population there should be, and then managing that?
Yes and no. We don't have caps on the bear population, but we do. One of our mandates is to maximize recreational opportunity, and that includes wildlife view, everything between wildlife viewing and hunting. And so on the hunting side to that, we have different parameters that kind of reflect the status of the bear population. We look at the percentage of females in the harvest, of course the number of bears harvested, the median ages of harvested males and harvested females. And so we have a lower threshold and an upper threshold of those parameters that we'd like to be within. And if our data suggests that we have we can take more bears and maximize recreational opportunity, we'll increase season length or do other things. If we compare our data to those parameters and it suggests that no, we may be taking a few too many, we don't want to have any long-term impacts to the bear population, we may curtail the season length a little bit or make some other conservative changes.
Okay.
So for the most part, Washington is, there's a couple areas where we're kind of, I'd call it on the bubble of some of those parameters, but for the most part, Washington is we're within the population objectives that we'd like to be.
How do you actually study how big your population is? And I'm referring, of course, to what Maine does, where we do den visits, and we do, obviously the hunters must turn in a tooth.
Right. We do some of the same sort of things. We actually just initiated a large multi-year study, kind of a 6 to 8 year study, looking at bear populations in 2 areas of the state, eastern and western, where we're doing exactly what many other states do, capturing and collaring bears, collecting DNA, den investigations, doing all those sorts of things. We also collect tooth from our harvested bears. So we use the same tried and tested kind of strategies and methods, research methods for evaluating the bear population.
Do you look at the studies in other states? Do you look at particular states to compare what they're doing to what Washington is doing?
Absolutely. Well, from the research side, we always are comparing and looking at when we have our own data and kind of assessing how does that differ from other areas. And of course, the most relevant for us are some of the Oregon and Idaho and BC that are our neighboring areas that have similar kinds of environmental conditions.
That's kind of funny because I have asked every state this question, and the western states, obviously, when they look at their peer states, look at the ones with the same conditions out west. In the east here, Maine really tends to compare data with Quebec and New Brunswick, where we have the same types of forests. So,
right.
The proponents of the referendum can argue all they want that the west and the east coast are the same, but when the biologists get down to it, they're actually looking at states that resemble them.
Absolutely, and the biggest one is we talked about is already it's the forage base. Western environments and eastern environments are entirely different because of the fall mass production that occurs typically in the eastern environments, and the quantity and the quality of that is entirely different than western environments.
We have in Maine probably 3 big game species. We got deer, moose, and bear, essentially, and that's what our guides have to make a living off of. What big game species does Washington State have?
We have a couple different species of deer. We have mule deer, black-tailed deer, white-tailed deer. We have elk. We have black bear. We have cougar. Mm-hmm. We have bighorn sheep, mountain goats, moose. Trying to think if the list goes on there. I think that's most of them.
It sounds
so those are the big game hunted species. Turkey, not a big game species, but certainly a hunted species, and then, of course, it goes down onto several birds and small mammals and stuff.
At this point, we have too many turkeys. Would you like some?
I think we're okay.
All right. Are there big game animals huntable with hounds in Washington?
No. The same voter initiative that banned the use of dogs for hunting bears also banned the use of dogs for hunting cougar. Okay.
Now, last couple of questions, I guess. What percentage of the state is publicly owned? Any idea?
I don't know that number. Fairly, we have a pretty good chunk of public lands in this state. Forest Service, BLM, national parks, those kinds of things.
Yeah, when you're comparing hunting opportunities between the East and the West, of course, the East is older and most of the land was privatized before there was any federal ownership. And you look at the Western states and you get up to 30, even 40% public ownership of some of the land in the states.
Right, and I suspect we're in that neighborhood. Mm-hmm. We have a fair amount of public lands in the state.
How about percent of forested area? Have any idea how much of the state is forested?
I should know those things, but I'd venture 2/3 of the state is forested.
Okay, yeah, that sounds about right. I've been to Washington a couple of times, and I absolutely loved it, and I look forward to doing it again. Yeah.
So there is one other one that I just want to make sure to round out your story for you. That one other topic with some of the changes that we saw with our voter initiative and kind of bear management, and that is on the conflict side.
Yes.
One of the things that's kind of, and is it okay if I switch gears on you?
Oh, by all means. I was going to ask about that anyway. In fact, hold that thought for a moment. We've got to take a break. My guest is Donnie Monterello, the top bear biologist in Washington State's Department of Fish and Wildlife. With another bear hunting referendum coming up in Maine, there's a debate about whether we can hunt bears in Maine the way they can hunt them in western states. So we're taking a moment to ask the western states. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. In Colorado, Oregon, and Washington, hunting bears with bait and hounds was banned by referendum in the mid-'90s. Ever since then, the Humane Society of the United States has been trying to get it banned here, too. One referendum failed in 2004. 10 years later, it's the same debate, and we'll vote on it this fall. One thing you hear a lot is that Maine hunters don't need any additional tools for hunting bear, that we can still hunt and stalk bears the way they do out west. Opponents say that's nuts. In the west, the bears are often hunted along ridges and in thin understory where you can often spot them from over a mile away. Today, I'm talking with biologists from Oregon and Washington about how bears are managed and hunted there. Donnie Monterello is the wildlife biologist in Washington, and just before the break, you were about to explain a particular challenge that made things difficult for bear management in your state.
So one of the things that's fairly unique to the Pacific Northwest is bear damage to trees. In this case, it's Douglas fir trees and a few other species that are managed on industrial timberlands. And so, for example, in Washington, we have also a fair amount of industrial timberlands, timber companies that produce mostly Doug fir. And in the springtime, with the moisture levels we have and the kinds of springs that we have, there's a very high sugar content underneath the bark of those trees. And that coincides with the time of year that bears come out of their dens, and there's not a lot of natural foods available. And the bears have found out through the years that if I take this bark off this tree, there's some really good stuff for me. and so we have a fair amount of bear damage to trees on industrial timberlands. And one of the things that occurred, how that's been managed and stuff prior to the voter initiative is hunters really provided that relief to those timber companies. Hunters, through the seasons and regulations that were provided by the Department of Fish and Wildlife, hunters were able to those lands were available with open access and things for hunters, and the bears that were removed by hunters for recreational purposes kind of met the needs for the timber company to try to address and mitigate a little bit of their bear damage to their timber resources. When we went through the voter initiative, there was a clause included within that law that said the use of dogs and bait are unlawful for hunting bears, except for private industrial timber companies can still use dogs and contracted hunters to remove bears associated with tree damage. And so then we went into a new phase and kind of a new management approach to where those bears that are involved in damaging timber resources on these private lands, instead of being removed by recreational hunters, are removed by contracted hunters. And that's part of it. That didn't really completely address the tree damage problem. They've also instituted a supplemental feeding program to try to short stop the bears from damaging trees. They gave them a different food source in the springtime. And then we issue these permits now to the timber companies to remove bears associated with tree damage, and they contract hunters to go do it, et cetera. So the one thing that we did see after the voter initiative that banned the use of dogs and bait is on the dog side, we had to go out and try to find new remedies, new methods to address this conflict issue. And it took us from one where we were able to use recreational hunters at a very low cost, and through time had kind of was working well, to a new situation, new methods, new trial and error, and some of the pains and things associated with that over the years.
Yeah, the math sounds kind of funny to me. At one point, you've got sportsmen who are willing to pay a license fee to go solve this nuisance bear problem in the industrial forest lands. Now you actually have to pay people and raise the expense in order to get the same job done.
So now the agency provides depredation permits to the industrial private timber companies to remove bears from their lands through these contracted hunters. And that process is not perfect. And so we've also now are experimenting with, or through trial and error, are using USDA Wildlife Services to go out and trap bears and remove them, lethally remove them, or to use dogs and lethally remove the bears. We're also using, we're experimenting with other methods where, like I said, with not with a recreational hunter, but more of a deputized control officer or agent to go out and do that. And so, so those are new challenges for us to try to resolve that conflict issue that we've had to deal with over the years. And it's not perfect. We haven't found a perfect solution yet.
Yeah, we don't have bears eating our trees much, but they certainly can cause damage in blueberry fields and certainly agricultural crops especially in the northern part of the state. So,
sure.
One of the things you can do with baiting, I guess, is actually target where you do the baiting. Landowners up here, especially in the industrial forest lands, have been pretty welcoming to it. And so you can sort of target exactly what part of the population you need to remove just by being discreet about where you put the bait.
Well, and from my perspective and my hat that I wear here with the agency, we tend to be in favor of having as many tools as we can have for managing the resource, and certainly respect and understand and comply with, the voter initiatives and those kinds of things. That's the public speaking, and like I said, I respect that and manage around that. But from just the narrow window of managing the resource and stuff, having that full toolbox of different ways to manage the resource is always something we'd like to see.
What we seem to be talking about is you have a longer hunting season, you allow 7-day-a-week hunting, which Maine doesn't. We need to harvest more bears than we're currently doing, but at least you're meeting your management goals. It is hard to compare Maine and Washington State in any meaningful way at all.
Yeah, and it's. I mean, I think there are some general lessons to be learned. I think that from not in Maine's shoes, but from our perspective, I would certainly expect that harvest success would go down. You're going from very efficient methods of using dogs and bait and traps and those kinds of things to less efficient methods of just boot hunting or spot and stalk kinds of things. And so certainly success rates will go down. And so will there be a change there? Would the agency look to longer seasons or split seasons or spring seasons or whatever? Those are all things that Maine might look at, but success rates would go down.
Yeah, boy, that's going to be a real challenge for us. Spring is the time you would normally hunt bears as they're coming out of the den would be during our mud season, and I can't see private landowners getting all that excited about trucks going up and messing up their roads.
Sure.
And then Sunday hunting is a tradition that has not been in Maine ever. I guess we're Puritan, so
right.
So getting rid of that, that no Sunday hunting thing is going to be difficult to sell in the state. I'm not sure exactly what we're going to do.
Right.
My guest has been Donnie Monterello, the state of Washington's chief bear biologist at the Department of Fish and Wildlife. During the current debate over whether to ban Maine's traditional hunting techniques, our state is constantly being compared to Western states. Up next, Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine goes to Oregon on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. One side says Maine can give up its current tools for bear hunting and do like they do in Oregon. The other side says that the vegetation and terrain in Oregon is nothing like the thick cover that we have in Maine. So I'm wondering, has anyone actually talked to Oregon? Greg Jackal is a biologist at the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. So let's see if this whole debate is comparing apples and oranges. Welcome to the show, Greg.
Well, thank you, Bob.
What is your title in Oregon?
So I'm a district wildlife biologist, and I'm centered in kind of the central part of Oregon, so east of the Cascade Mountains in kind of the central part of the state.
Yeah, Oregon's a pretty diverse state. You've got really almost a rainforest on the west side, don't you, and kind of dry in the east?
Yeah, so we've got a very diverse habitats. We've got Coast Range, which is directly what you just said. It's a very thick rainforest type habitats. And we have the Cascade Range that runs north-south. It's a little more open, but it's still pretty thick timbered. And then we get into eastern Oregon where we have a lot of sagebrush, but also the Blue Mountains, and it goes up into the Wallowas. And so it's a little more open pine forests. So very diverse state.
A lot of the claims are made, I guess, by referendum proponents in the state of Maine that the hunting's been pretty good in Oregon since baiting was eliminated, and I'm just wondering how things have changed in the 2 decades since they did it.
Yeah, so it's changed a lot, and of course I wasn't around. I was pretty young when the referendum was in place. Actually, I remember I was in high school, so I don't remember directly folks hunting with the aid of dogs or bait. So I can just kind of speak to what's occurred since. But, we have kind of 2 different ways we can hunt bears in Oregon. We have a general fall season, which encompasses most of the state of Oregon. It's over-the-counter tag. Folks can just go purchase it before a certain date, and they can go hunt in the fall. And then in the springtime, we do have spring bear hunts in a lot of parts of Oregon, and those are a little more controlled. So the biologists have a chance to look at the estimated bear populations for their areas and then regulate tags based on a permit system where the hunters will have to go in and actually apply for that, so it's limited entry. Some of those hunts are a little more popular than others, take a little more time to draw than others. So
yeah. Now, I read somewhere, and I wish I could even quote the source, but one of the reasons that the spring hunting season came along is because there was a little bit too much predation on elk and deer.
Yeah, I mean, the probably was maybe a little bit to do with that, but I think mainly it was also just another opportunity for folks to have that chance to go out and potentially harvest a bear. So, going out in the field, some of our studies have shown that, in certain areas, black bears will have an impact on elk calves and deer fawns. But it's kind of shortened, and it's really time specific. So it's that period of time when the fawns are dropping, the calves are dropping. Those bears will have a sense to go after those like anything else,
right.
Coyotes or other predators.
Well, has there been a surging interest in bear hunting in the last couple of decades, do you think?
I wouldn't say that there's probably been a surging interest in bear hunting in Oregon. I think, from my perspective, not knowing how the hunting was with, using bait and hounds, I think the popularity is still there. And if you ask folks, there might be some pros and cons to both methods. Certainly in some parts of Oregon that are more open, in the northeast corner of the state and some parts of the state in the southwest where there's a lot more open habitats, you'd probably hear from hunters that they enjoy that type of hunting where they're spot and stalking bears in open timbered habitats, so they can glass open ridge lines where bears are out feeding in the springtime and in the fall.
So you can see for miles.
Oh yeah, you can see for very far, and spotting scope, and there's days you can see upwards of 10 bears a day, and then pick which one you want to go after.
Oh, no kidding! See, in here you're lucky to see one from under 100 yards.
Yeah, and so there's definitely parts of Oregon like that on the Coast Range where it makes it very challenging, to find one because of the timber cover. So that would make it more advantageous to have either hounds or bait in order for you to properly identify the sex of the bear and make sure it's not has cubs or stuff like that. So.
What is the hunting season for bears? I think you're the only one of the 3 western states that has banned baiting and hounding that does have some kind of a limited spring season. Could you go over that again?
Yeah, so we have a limited spring season, and it starts generally. It depends on what part of the state you're in, but generally from April, and I think most of those hunts are April, May. So it's kind of like a turkey season type of deal. Either April 1st or April 15th is the opener, and then you got either a month and a half or 2 months to hunt. So you're usually done by the end of June. So that's a spring type season, and then our general fall season starts actually right now. Or earlier now. It's August 1, and it generally goes till November 30th. And again, there's little changes, different parts of regions of Oregon, but that's generally what it goes.
Yeah, it seems to me that if you go to the end of November, if that were Maine, most of our bears have gone into hibernation by then. Is there a hibernation period typical in Oregon?
That's a good question. There's definitely parts of Oregon that are a lot more, I guess rougher winters and probably earlier winters. But there's a lot of Oregon that's kind of we don't get a ton of snow in a lot of the state of Oregon. Eastern Oregon, we have areas where probably you're going to see more of that typical hibernation period where they're going to have to start, looking probably around that time period, maybe even during the hunting season. You might find some bears that are starting to wander towards their hibernation spots. But the rest of Oregon, it's pretty mild, and so it's not really weather related. I would think.
Is hunting allowed on Sunday in your state?
On Sunday?
Yeah.
Yeah, we have no restrictions on days, days of the week.
Okay. How many bears are hunters allowed to harvest in a year, especially if you've got 2 seasons?
So I believe they would be able to harvest a fall bear, a spring bear, obviously with appropriate tags. And then I think there is extended opportunities in parts of Oregon, like the Southwest, where there potentially is an additional fall black bear. So if you're really into harvesting bears, I think you can harvest 3 in the state of Oregon. That probably rarely happens. There might be a few hunters that are really really good at what they do and know where to look for them. But
who has a freezer that big?
Exactly.
So there is a difference in the hunting style, I would think, between western and eastern Oregon. What are the most effective hunting techniques, would you say, in the thickest parts, the parts that have the coastal forest that would be a little more similar to Maine?
So I think the most effective way is if you can go to a clear cut that's a harvested unit that's just been harvested, and either glass from a distance or sit on some berry patches. Those are things that I've talked to folks that have done and have found success. Just walking through the woods, thick covered woods, it's really tough. But if you have an opening that, especially a food source like berries or even grass or stuff that they're eating in the spring, utilizing that. I don't think many people use tree stands. I just think it's mainly going out to these berry patches and kind of trying to find one.
I'm on the horn with Greg Jackal, a biologist with the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. Proponents of the upcoming referendum to change Maine's bear hunting laws say that we should just learn to hunt like they do out west. But Oregon has spring hunting, and fall hunting starts in midsummer, when there are still berries and chokecherries. And even in the thick forest on the west coast of Oregon, the canopy is high enough that it is still possible to spot bears at a distance. So how comparable are these two states? Up next, does the state of Oregon actively try to manage the bear population? This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. You're listening to Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine, and we're comparing apples and Oregons, as in bear hunting and management in the Beaver State. Maine has been conducting black bear research for 40 years, and a citizen process determines how big the bear population should be before we start to see negative impacts like disease and problem bears. Greg Jackal is a biologist for Oregon's Department of Fish and Wildlife. So does Oregon try to manage the bear population, Greg?
Yeah, so we obviously have legal seasons, and there's also large industrial private timber owners in Western Oregon that probably use wildlife services to take control of some of the damage that's occurring by black bears. And then we also do a study where we basically will bait bears in all parts of Oregon with tetracycline, and it kind of we'll set out bear baits in the summer, kind of right after our spring season, and basically the bait is comprised of rolled up bacon and bacon grease, and so the bears will be attracted to it, and they'll eat that and ingest the tetracycline, which is an antibiotic. And what it'll do is it'll stain their teeth. And so over time, it'll give us, and we also have mandatory bear check-in. If you're a hunter and harvest a bear in Oregon, you have to bring us the skull, and we have to check it in. Mm-hmm. So when they do that, we take the teeth out of it. So it's kind of a mark recapture over a whole state, which can make the statistics a little bit challenging, but it allows us to kind of look at our bear population over time and probably look at it in a little more regional zone approach and try to determine a population estimate for the whole state.
Yeah. Is there an ideal population you're trying to strive for so that you don't have either too few or too many?
We do have a bear management plan, and so we kind of have targets for each of the zones. Obviously, there's certain areas where they come in contact with agriculture, and so we, with orchards and different things, and so there's some bear damage that's occurring in some parts of Oregon, not everywhere in Oregon, but some parts, and so in those areas it may be, a little more liberal harvest to try to account for some of that, and so, but we definitely have goals for managing a sustainable population of black bears in the whole state where there's habitat, so.
Yeah, how are you doing in hitting those goals? Any idea?
Pretty good, yeah. I mean, it seems like, again, there's bears, densities are higher in some parts of Oregon than others, probably I would assume like other states, but we are doing pretty good at meeting those goals.
Yeah, we seem to have the highest density around my bird feeders.
Yeah.
Now, how does the state handle bear and nuisance complaints? Who gets the job?
So it kind of depends on where you are in Oregon. There are places in Oregon where there's federal wildlife services agents that'll do a lot of that type of work. Those are kind of called the old government trappers. And so depending on where you are in Oregon, sometimes there's an agent in that county, and they can assist the Fish and Wildlife with that. If we're not in an area where there's a government agent, then a lot of times we'll do some of the trapping, if there's a nuisance bear around a campground or, a person's orchard tree or something. Generally we do non-lethal to begin with, and then it, elevates up the ladder. But, we can handle it. And then there's also, as I mentioned earlier, the large industrial timber owners in Western Oregon. Sometimes they will have their own agents that they'll have do some of their damage control on, some of their seedlings and saplings. Bears will come in and do some damage there. So,
are they permitted to use lethal means if necessary?
Exactly. Yeah, they are.
Okay.
Yeah.
Maine has basically among big game animals, we got deer, moose, and bear, and that's about it. But what big game species do you have that keep your guides employed?
So we've got Rocky Mountain elk as well as Roosevelt elk. Mm-hmm. So Roosevelts are on the Coast Range of Oregon, kind of the Cascades in the western part, and then Rocky Mountain elk are in the eastern part of the state. We have mule deer, black-tailed deer, which is kind of on the western part of the state in the Coast Range, and then part of the Cascades. Let's see. We also have pronghorn antelope ranging through the kind of the southeast part of the state, the desert, kind of the part of the Great Basin extending into Oregon. We also have some whitetail populations in kind of the northeastern part of the state. And we do have a few moose kind of coming in that northeast part of the state too. So we don't have a lot of moose habitat, very limited, but we do have a few moose coming down from Washington and Idaho.
Yeah.
So.
Any bighorn sheep or anything like that? Or?
Yeah, so we have bighorn sheep. We have California subspecies and Rocky Mountain subspecies bighorn sheep, and then we also have Rocky Mountain goats in a few areas of Oregon. So we got quite a bit of everything, a little bit of everything.
You have mountain lions, don't you?
Oh yeah, we have mountain lions, good healthy population of mountain lions. We do have some wolf packs springing up in the northeast corner of the state, and so we have a state management plan for those, and as well as a lot of the state being federally managed. Mm-hmm. And we actually have currently this year, a wolf pack that's established itself in the western part of Oregon. OR7 was a pretty popular wolf and traveled all the way across Oregon and down into California. Was the first radio-collared wolf to go into California since extirpation, and so it's a pretty, the media was really following that wolf, and it kind of went up north around Medford, Oregon, which is in the south. And we thought it was by itself, and then this spring, biologists went out and located the den with pups, and so obviously there's a female with.
Got to be another one around somewhere.
Yeah, so that's pretty cool to see that expansion into some other habitats. So.
Yeah, got a couple of questions that are a little bit out of left field, just about what % of Oregon is actually publicly owned. Do you have any idea?
Quite a bit of Oregon is publicly owned. I wouldn't say half of it, but quite a bit of it. I'm not sure. It's probably pretty close to probably 40% is publicly owned. So we have a lot of national forests, a lot of BLM, and then we have state forest lands and state lands in part of Oregon too. So depending on where you are, there's quite a bit of public hunting opportunities as well as public lands to go out and recreate. So
yeah, Maine is about 90% forested, I think. Do you have any idea what percentage Oregon is forested?
So, as I said earlier, we have the Coast Range and the Cascades, and then we have kind of the Blue Mountains, and then everything in between. So I would say, maybe 50 to 60% of that is forested. That might be a little high, but we have quite a bit of we have quite a bit of forest. Barring the Willamette Valley is a big open valley, and then we have the southeast part of Oregon that's a lot of desert, juniper country, and then kind of the northeast part is kind of the Columbia Basin. So some of those areas don't have trees, but so the hotbed of areas for bear habitat obviously is the timbered, thicker timbered sections of Oregon.
I'm actually trying to plan a trip to Oregon even later on this year, and I'm really hoping that it's as good as it sounds.
Yeah. Well, if you do, give me a call. We any of our district offices, we have biologists spread across the state, and we welcome visitors from all parts of it. I truly believe that Oregon's probably one of the most scenic areas. We have the coastline. We have the mountains, we have the desert. We just have a little bit of everything in Oregon, so it's a neat state.
Yeah, is there any place I should avoid?
No, I mean, I think, yeah, probably the cities. No, but the cities are fun too. I mean, Portland's a good city, and Eugene, you got the Ducks and the Beavers playing football, and so.
Well, in Maine we have our own Portland, so I can skip that.
That's true. Yeah. Portland, Oregon's probably a little bit different than Portland, Maine. I would assume. They have bumper stickers in Portland, Oregon that say "Keep Portland Weird." So.
That's Greg Jackal, bear biologist with the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. In the mid-'90s, voters in Colorado, Oregon, and Washington approved a ban on using bait and hounds to hunt bears. And this fall, the Humane Society of the United States is trying to do the same thing here. Since both sides of the main debate point to those states out west as an indication of what could go right or wrong, we're asking those states. Today we featured Washington and Oregon. Next week, Colorado. Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine is brought to you by Hammond Lumber, Old Town Trading Post, Dysarts, EBS, and Napa Auto Parts. This show is archived on the web at 929theticket.com. Join us next Saturday morning at 9 a.m. on Sports Radio 929 The Ticket.